Hi, it's Jeff Gordon at Writers Boot Camp. We're going to interview our longtime pro member alum, Rob Samborn, about his 3-book deal. And if you have questions because you're watching or listening at a later date, please email me, jg@writersbootcamp.com. Thanks. Hello, everyone. Welcome today. Rob should be with us in a couple of minutes. I told him to check in a few minutes later because of how slow people join Zooms. So happy Friday. I can't believe Thanksgiving is next week. If you're traveling, hope you're well. People are checking in with me to try to get on. Can you guys type in the chat to see if it's working? Hey, Brad, do you know why? Yeah, Brad's checking that out. Oh, the Q&A looks like it's on, so it's possible that when we set this up. So feel free to communicate in the Q&A in the meantime. We have 4 or 5 questions at the end that we'll cover first. So feel free to use the Q&A function. Things are a little different when we do webinar. Excuse me. When we do webinars, it works a bit differently. So welcome everybody. Our speaker should be here in a second. Nothing like reading a 334-page book in 24 hours. Has everybody read the book? Gotten the book? It'll be interesting nonetheless. Rob Samborn.
Jeff Gordon, how are you, my friend?
Great to see you. Welcome. Welcome back to Writers Boot Camp via Zoom.
Thank you. How are you today?
Doing well. We have people checking in. There's a Q&A function instead of the chat. I've got 4 or 5 questions for later at the end. Did I tell you that we moved back to Bergamot?
You did. I think that's fantastic. Congratulations.
Yeah, if you happen to be in LA on December 10th, we're having a Writers Boot Camp social. We're focusing on the Screenwriting Museum project that day. It's part of the gallery's quarterly and seasonal event where there are many artist talks. So I don't know if you remember the distinction, but now Writers Boot Camp is in the B building, where we have the space that used to be the old landlord's offices and patio. So instead of 11,000 feet, we have 1,000 feet. So if you need some vintage furniture, just let me know. But I've divested of about 6 storage pods and a garage and a shed and many tchotchkes from the house.
That's a lot. Yeah, I always loved the Writers Boot Camp location. I mean, it was just this space really was inspiring for creativity. You know, you go in there, it was like fresh and had amazing furniture, and you just wanted to write. And as you know, I'm a huge fan of Bergamot Station as well. So I'm not going to be there on the 10th, but I wish I was, because I'd love to attend.
And then where are you guys living exactly now?
Denver.
Great.
Yeah.
And have you been taking advantage of the outdoors?
Yeah, to a degree, so it depends upon the season and everything. But yeah, so we do the outdoors really are the mountains, right? So in the summertime, you can go up there and go camping and hiking, and there's some lakes and things like that. And obviously wintertime is skiing or snowboarding. So the mountains have opened, but I haven't gone yet this year, but I do have my Epic Pass. So
That's awesome. Well, welcome back. As an LA Pro member, we're excited about your success, and then we'll speak a lot about the intersection between screenwriting and books and publishing and your perspective of that. So I have a flow of questions and thoughts, and we'll go through it. I just want to emphasize a congratulatory, statement for your persistence, your ingenuity, but also your talent. And of course, we appreciate, that alumni who succeed come back and share their insight. It's helpful. And we have a number of pro members attending today. I checked out Touchpoint Press and their website, quite an active outfit. How did they find you or you find them?
Yeah, great question. Before I answer that question, I want to thank you so much for having me on this interview, I guess we could call it. And it's also thank you so much for all those accolades. And, I have to say, I can trace, this is unplanned for anybody watching. This is not a Writer's Boot Camp ad or anything like that. Jeff has no idea that I'm about to say this. But I can trace the success I've had with my book directly right back to Writers Boot Camp, and I'll explain that later, but there is a direct line without question. And in answer to your question about Touchpoint Press, yeah, so they are kind of one of the larger indie presses in publishing. They are very active, and I didn't actually find them. My agents found them. So I do have an agent for books. And when they went out submitting my book, Touchpoint Press is one of the publishers that they submitted to, and Touchpoint ended up giving me a 3-book deal.
And how does it become, in addition to concept and story, the ideation, how does it become a 3-book deal? Because I have to tell you, and you may remember this from many mini camps and also side conversations, the cliche of a newer writer without any execution to illustrate their potential will say, I have a trilogy.
Yeah.
And my feeling is, yeah, great. That's great. It's fantastic that you're ambitious. I don't mean to tamp down the ambition. Let's just look at the pragmatic side of things and say, well, how about one first?
Yes. And I think this is the case in screenwriting and book writing, that when you're querying, a lot of people are like, yeah, this has serious potential or whatever. I mean, maybe if you're pitching a show or something like that, it might be a little bit different, but absolutely, especially if it's a full-length movie, a feature movie, or a book, the focus should be on one. And when I was pitching to my agent, it was on one. So now going back to what I was saying about how I can trace that line directly from Writers Boot Camp to my current success, I did, as you know, write the original version of the first book as a script while I was at Writers Boot Camp. And the intent was always for that to be a standalone. I never actually even considered making it more than one. But then just to give everybody a little bit of background. So that script was optioned by a production company founded by DreamWorks executives. Unfortunately, it was never made into a movie. And then when the rights reverted back to me, I decided to adapt it into a book. And by the way, I had the brilliant idea of, yeah, I'll write it as a book really quick, turn that out, and then I'll have the screenplay ready to go.
Well,
obviously, it doesn't work like that.
No, but it can. The novelizing of unproduced scripts can, when done well, and in certain parameters and marketing factors, can renew interest in the screenplay.
Yes.
And attempting formats, and that we believe in crossover between movies and TV, but also we've realized from the 20th and 25th anniversary of the company that hundreds of our alumni have books published, which we took for granted back in the day, because it's much more difficult to structure screenplays and TV scripts, and because you're telling the story using the parts of the story. But then prose is so much more accessible to the reader, and you can riff, which we'll discuss in your style.
Yeah.
Well, one quick thing, too. How many stages of development did you go through with the producers, and how much did they possibly exhaust the options for third-party financiers and studios? What was their vision for what that script could be? And then secondly, I just wanted to read the quote on Touchpoint about how they describe the company.
Okay.
Because there's a difference between, it's not to say self-publishing can't lead to something. I spoke with a woman recently who dealt with infertility issues, and she had a book self-published, but it was so successful that a real publisher picked it up.
Right.
But this is a real publishing deal.
Yeah.
It's not a vanity press.
Right. Exactly. It's not. So really quickly, just to wrap up on the trilogy. So when I adapted it into a book, it organically evolved into so much more than my original intent. Really, from a character perspective, they wanted to continue their story, those I didn't kill. And so I had told that idea to my agents, and when they were out pitching it to publishers, they actually broached that subject. And basically, on the strength of the source material, it got that 3-book deal. And then going back to your other question, what was your other question?
Well, I'll segue to include, what was the format of what,
Right.
how did you attract the book agents? And then what was the format of what the publishers needed? This is always helpful, because a lot of writers will say, well, I don't need to write the book yet.
Yeah.
And you can go off on sidebars and tangents, and not necessarily whether it's abiding structure or hitting a certain target. So what was the format of what they were getting out there for you?
They were sending a synopsis of the first book, and also a synopsis of the second and third book, as well as the full manuscript of the first book.
Right. So you had and did they have comments on how it could be adjusted or changed? And did you learn from the development process with the producers what it needed to be that it might not hadn't been yet in the script form?
Yeah, these are fantastic questions, Jeff. And it all goes back to story, right? Like, what is the best way to tell a particular story? And there really could be 1,000 or more ways to tell one story. And it does go all the way back to the producers. I met with them quite a bit. We had a lot of development meetings, and there were ideas of maybe taking this more into the horror dimension. And then ultimately, so regarding the financiers, I don't know actually if they exhausted that or not. But we did have multiple iterations of the script. And then it changed again while I was adapting it. And then when I pitched it when I was out querying for agents, there was one version. And then when my agents signed me, they did have a ton of notes, actually. I probably wrote twice as many words over the course of the next few drafts from that point as to what the final published version is. So like the beginning is completely different and the ending is completely different, but that story nugget, like was ended up being, okay, what again is the best way to tell this story? And I think that we did nail it. And that also doing that enabled the other two books to really be the best that they are. And by the way, even from there, I actually have a spin-off series, which is kind of cool.
Right. Well, I appreciate that expansion. Also, I just want to thank you. It's a great read. And it's not like, I mean, I didn't forget that we were meeting today, but about 3-4 days ago, I said to myself, holy, I have to read the book. And, when you work in the business, reading it feels like work at times. This was not work, except for extracting profound questions and points in the book. But I really enjoyed it. And there's one of the quotes by one of the fellow writers at the beginning. They said it's an immersive, and it's absolutely immersive. And you've created a great ensemble. Not that it's an ensemble story per se. So the publishing company says that they are a traditional royalty-paying publisher of digital and print fiction and nonfiction, striving to be innovative and energetic in all we do, from acquisitions to promotion before and after publication. I thought traditional royalty-paying publisher, but of digital and print fiction. I thought that's what I needed to know. And in your experience now, what one or two things have you learned about publishing that you either respect more? Obviously, you're on the good side of things. It's pretty amazing, a 3-book deal, right?
Yeah. I also have a 3-book audiobook deal as well with actually the audiobook publisher.
And that's a separate company.
That is a separate company. And that company is called Tantor Media.
Tantor, right.
Yeah.
Okay, so it seems, having known each other a long time, and also during our core years at Bergamot, which it seems so natural for you and your combination of facets in your background to have arrived at this juncture. What is your art background, your education in that realm? The bio and the communique, the invite covered ground as far as your travels and language and those interests. But can you just briefly reflect on that process and maybe how you've integrated various facets of your background to create a refined perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. And I think that perspective actually bleeds into my work because it's very art focused. So most of my art so I have, I guess, 3 sides of an art background. One is dabbling very, very briefly as an artist. 2 is as a moderate collector of mostly emerging talent. And then 3 is I actually started an art-based tech startup a number of years ago.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So for all 3 of those, so for doing stuff as an artist, primarily self-taught. I mean, I've taken like small classes and things like that. And then as a collector, it really is from just interest, but my parents have always been into art collecting as well. So I think a lot of it comes from that. And then on the business side of things, that, I do have like kind of a business background, sales and marketing and business development background. And that stemmed from—
That's the entrepreneur part of your bio.
That's the entrepreneur part of it. Yeah. And I had a business called Spark Brush. Unfortunately, I had to fold, but it was a very cool business that was for art collectors, art galleries, and artists to track the value of art, manage art collections, and then also buy and sell art on the secondhand market. Yeah.
Yeah, that royalty issue is important for artists, and I think it's why, you know, blockchain and NFTs are so interesting right now. So,
For sure.
so how were you specifically inspired by Jacopo's Tintoretto's painting Il Paradiso, or the Paradise?
Yeah.
What was the
So
depth of that exposure and study and experience and that location and Renaissance period art?
that's a great question as well. Yeah. And so as I was saying, my interest in art has bled into my creative work. So for the audience, I'll give you my rusty premise line.
Right.
So people have some context here. So my first book is called The Prisoner of Paradise. And when Nick and Julia O'Connor, an American couple, travel to Venice, Italy, not Venice, LA, but Venice, Italy, on vacation, Nick comes to believe that his true soulmate is not Julia, but a woman whose soul has been trapped in this painting Paradise by Tintoretto, which is the world's largest oil painting for 450 years. And on a quest to learn more, he discovers a religious order that has developed a method of extracting people's souls, which they imprison as a type of purgatory in this painting. And they claim all the souls are evil. And Nick is desperate to save his beloved from a past life, but liberating her means freeing all the souls, and this order will never let that happen. So that's the first book in a nutshell.
Amazing.
Thanks.
And the second book, Swordsman of Venice, has been published a month ago,
so the
right?
Swordsman of Venice is actually one of the spin-offs that I was talking about, and that was published in September. And then the second book, the second full-length book, is called Painter of the Damned, and that was published actually about 3 weeks ago. And actually, I have it right here. So
Right.
This is the first book, which is called The Prisoner of Paradise by me, Rob Samborn. And here's the second book, Painter of the Damned, also by me.
I like the different typeface on that title. So,
Thanks. Yeah.
so what? That's a unique title. When you look up the phrase "prisoner of paradise," it's something that's been used often as a title from some bluer, accessible work to even an Oscar-nominated documentary by another alumnus, Stuart Sender, which was based on artists at a specific concentration camp.
Yeah.
But what's great is that even though it's an iconic phrase, there's an irony to the phrase, and then you give it a specific reference to the circumstance of the story going back in time.
Thank you.
And that so the study or the awareness of that impressive. I mean, I hadn't remembered the painting, and then I Googled it, and I was intimidated when it was on my iPad late at night. It's like it's a mythological kind of. It's almost like these images, these beings. It's like overlooking a city, with the depth of it. And I want to be careful not to spoil twists and story turns today. And I did think it was a refreshing choice not to depict the couple, Nick and Julia, inherently unhappy. And even though I think Midnight in Paris is a very good film, I think it could have been even more interesting had the marriage not been an obvious mismatch.
Yeah.
And so that provides kind of a rooting interest. But go back to either your own experience of being in that room, and then how the concept, not the conceit per se, in the terms of how it's rolled down, but how the idea of almost like, I don't want to say any more to give it away, but how that idea came to you.
Yeah, so the inspiration really comes from two different sources in my head anyway. One is that I've always been fascinated with the idea of soulmates. What is that intangible connection that two people feel? It's not only romantic, by the way. You could feel it with a friend, right? Where you have that connection, that intangible connection. So I always wanted to write something about that, but I didn't want it to be kind of like a straight romance. So I always had that sort of idea in my head. And then on a trip to Venice, I actually saw a different painting by Tintoretto called The Crucifixion, which is obviously about the crucifixion. But as where most
Are there two versions of it? Something.
there's at least, well, first of all, there's three versions of Paradise by Tintoretto, and that actually plays into the trilogy.
Right.
You can imagine where that goes.
Okay.
And then and in real life. So the other two versions of Paradise, one is in the Louvre and one is in a museum in Madrid. And then the Crucifixion, he painted at least two paintings called the Crucifixion, but like every painter back then did, right? But whereas most paintings about the Crucifixion are like hyper-focused on Jesus on the cross, this particular one that I'm talking about is almost like an establishing shot. Imagine if you had like a drone establishing shot. It's like a village. There's all three crosses are going up. There's like 75 people in this painting. It's also huge. It's not nearly as big as Paradise. And for the listeners who have not seen Paradise, it is the world's largest oil painting. It's like 80 feet wide by 40 feet high and has over 500 people in this painting. It's incredible. The Crucifixion has about 75, and each one looks like an individual portrait from all different walks of life. So I was starting to think like, well, who were these people that got immortalized into this work? And they truly are immortalized. And obviously, painters still to this day use models, but when you're working on that scale, do you have a line of people outside your door? So I took that kind of thought and combined that with the soulmate idea and thought, okay, well, what if it's their souls that have immortalized them into it? And then from there, I actually started doing the research and found Paradise. And still to this day, it actually gives me chills about how perfect the painting Paradise is for the story that I wanted to tell, as well as the name, by the way. And I do think that I use irony the most in my title.
I thought I was impressed, and I want to cover a little bit of ground on some concept choices, structure, character development, and scene work, if we have time. But I thought it was interesting that you didn't belabor Nick's fascination in that moment. Now, Nick is a hockey player. He's not just a meathead. And I think hockey players are tough and they're underrated in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought it was interesting. And I liked how you didn't necessarily telegraph something that Nick had to necessarily learn. But it's impossible not to consider the Da Vinci Code conceptually. And then I recently saw that movie again, and it's easy to watch and it was easy to read. And while Tom Hanks as the lead has relatively little character development, there was some allusion to a shift in the last 10 minutes as they're saying their farewells. So were you concerned about when you started the script even? And because I would have questioned it, I wouldn't have stopped you. I would have helped you test to find the uniqueness, which I think you have. But how did you initially differentiate, especially with the overlapping subject of secret societies? And I'm not going to spoil that either.
Yeah, I think so. First of all, it's interesting, and this is going back to the intersection of Hollywood and publishing, is that everybody wants something in both. I think everybody wants something unique, but is also similar to something else that's been out there. And even
as a way to justify the risk.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think potentially even more so in publishing. When you're querying, you're almost required to include comps. I think maybe to a bigger degree than if you're querying for a screenplay. So yes, more often than not, my work is compared to the Da Vinci Code or Dan Brown's work, and also Outlander is what I hear the most. Funnily enough, I actually don't think it's that similar really to either. And my book is multi-genre. We can actually go into that because that's a kind of interesting thing as well with publishing, compared to screenwriting and the difficulties of multi-genre work. But I think that kind of is where I went with it and how I distinguish it from something like the Da Vinci Code. I pointed to Dan Brown's work and the Da Vinci Code for success. particularly with historical thrillers and things that have secret societies and date back where they have different storylines and also
And
have
the history lessons inherent.
yes. So, but then I turned it on its head to say like, but I also have these other different unique elements, and it's not exactly that way. You know, at its core, really is a love story, which I think is pretty interesting across time, and some other conceits as well. You know, and also the Da Vinci Code isn't really a dual timeline story, whereas mine is.
As soon as we get into some of the writing details, what's your view, just before that, what's your view of whether reading is still something people do and what you've learned in terms of like the threshold of success? Like, is it a success if you sell 3,000 or 5,000 books? Or like what New York Times bestseller, what's that level right now? 10,000?
I'm not sure actually.
Somebody might know if they comment in the Q&A. But are you reading a lot? Because your prose is very fluid and yet succinct. It would be fun for us to have a sidebar one day and just go through and look at key words, because we all have involuntary reflexes.
Mhm.
And I might as well ask now, what was your expectation versus your own editing? Because, you know, we're training our screenwriters to be looking at craft and making those decisions. Did the publisher assign you an editor? Did you have to pay an editor? Did you, because I hope your answer is, oh, I didn't need an editor. I might,
A lot of people think, yeah, a lot of people say that. So first of all, to address the success question, honestly, it depends upon who you ask. So for a debut author who nobody knows, I would say that my debut has been a decent successful enough, right? But it also, you know, you don't want to go into this rabbit hole trap of comparing yourself either up or down. But I would say that it has been a success enough for me to keep going. It's not successful enough for me to quit my day job. So, you know, but hopefully, well, in case anyone's watching from my day job, which I should be doing right now, I don't want to quit that day job.
Well, that's why. Well, at least it's lunchtime here.
Yeah, exactly. It's my lunch.
You're just on your it's a late lunch today.
It's a late lunch, yeah. So Irene, it's a late lunch. And then in terms of an editor, so that's a great question. And before I actually got my agent, so before I even started querying, I did hire an editor on my own. So my writing now is so much better than it was. You know, there is a very, very, very steep learning curve, and I have learned a ton. I still hear very much that my writing is very cinematic, which goes back to screenwriting at my time at Writers Boot Camp, which is great. But at one point, it was really too cinematic. I needed to add in all those things that you have in a book, like internal thoughts and internal monologues and all these different things that you don't have in a script. So I actually hired an editor prior to querying. And then I did work with my agents. My agents act as managers as well, so they were awesome. So we worked on it then. And then once I signed with my publisher, they have an in-house editor. So, and she worked on it as well. So now moving forward, I actually did use my personal editor for the second book before I sent that draft. Not everybody does this, but I'm a bit of a perfectionist. So, and you know, it's kind of like what you're talking about with your own words. It's like you know, subconsciously you just use a lot of words or whatever, and it's just always better to have another set of eyeballs on it. So I did hire her to go through it before I sent my book to the publisher, and then again, their in-house editor actually went through it again.
Two examples of fun word reflection, and this doesn't pertain to your book, but lately I've been saying, is it suddenly or just the next moment? Or I'm from Chicago and I don't know why I use the word actually. and what it
Yeah,
means truly, except
everybody says that. Yeah.
it's a pivot. Um, can you tell us during the writing, what were a few exciting turns or creative choices you experienced? You know, there is, I've heard that M. Night Shyamalan, the twist of The Sixth Sense, which still would have been an interesting sullen ghost film,
Mhm.
was the fifth draft, happened during the fifth draft. So any emotional moments or levels of excitement, or did it just take too long to remember?
The biggest moment I would say for sure is when I started getting the kernels of the idea to expand it into a trilogy. And I think it probably happened when I discovered that there were, because I was kind of thinking that the story could go on. And then when I discovered that Tintoretto had painted two other versions of Paradise, I was just like, oh my God, like how perfect could this possibly be?
Right.
And the other really exciting moment, or moments, I should say, is that, you know, so my book, for the audience, most of it takes place in the present day, but about 35% of it takes place in the 16th century. So I have done a ton of research into 16th century Venice. And whenever and I always needed to kind of research something to fit my plot or to fit my characters or situation or whatever the case may be. And I use almost everything from the past as real, all the buildings, all the artwork, a lot of historical people. And whenever I needed something to fit the plot, invariably it was there in history, which is really, really cool. And I was just like, my God, this is so awesome that I can actually take this real person or this real event and fit it into my story that I want to tell.
Right, because the management of your time, the management of your reading, the efficiency level does not always translate to any kind of one-to-one relationship, and you want to feel productive. Well, and
Yeah.
by the way, when have you been writing? What's your weekly schedule?
So I do try to fit in at least 10 hours a week. And this is an interesting question as well. So I write primarily in the morning and at nights and on weekends. But the interesting thing about publishing, and going back to the differences between Hollywood and publishing, is something that, you know, and this is one of the revelations about publishing, something that nobody tells you, regardless of whether you're with a big five publisher, an independent publisher, or you're self-published, you're basically running your own business. And, you know, unless you're Michael Connelly or Stephen King or one of the huge names, you're doing all of this, especially as a debut author. You know, I do the vast majority of my own marketing and promotions and even advertising and everything. So a lot of my time that should be devoted to writing goes into marketing the book. And that's something that does not exist as a screenwriter.
And you've learned how to write a concise press release.
Yeah, so actually the publisher wrote the press release, but I have, yeah, and again, the learning curve is insane with all of this. So
Right.
I have learned a ton. Yeah.
Considering the percentages of the dual time periods, how did you determine the degree of action? One of the aspects I loved about the read was there are action sections, and early on, Angelo's action and your crisp detail, swiftly dispatching interactions and physical movements in a way that's very easy to see, I'm sure comes from the screenwriting experience. But you also seem to have an extra dose or knack of that. But what was the determination when somebody calls it an imaginative thriller? Well, they're emphasizing thriller, but that doesn't mean a thriller has that much action. A few, you know, going back to the Da Vinci Code, a few like encounters with somebody with a gun or getting into a cab or a car,
Yeah.
you know, a few seconds before somebody else. That's a different kind of action. So how did you determine the percentage or the degree?
It definitely goes back to screenwriting, you know, and looking, and by the way, and again, this is not an ad for Writers Bootcamp, but I still to this day use a ton of the tools that you and the other instructors at Writers Bootcamp taught me. And, a lot of when to put the action in is kind of, I wanted the book to have a good amount of action, but you also need to give the reader a breather, and especially in a book compared to a script where you do need those introspective scenes, which, you have like the scenes and what they call actually a sequel, which is, believe it or not, a writing term for essentially giving the reader a breather to kind of go into the head rather than you having like this highly engaging narrative scene or chapter. And so I would say it really boils down to not boring the reader from either side of things, whether it's these action scenes or it's these introspective scenes or it's these scenes where people are having a conversation, because also with a story like this, it does require a really good amount of exposition. And that's where it could also get very boring too, when you're just
Right.
having one of these
And
info
I have a
dumps.
few thoughts on that.
Yeah.
I liked the very beginning. And how many times did you consider, well, how many options did you consider for the first line in the book? Because the where you followed is great. And then I had to, after reading the first section, I had to go back to see, I moved forward and then went backward to see if that was almost a title that every section was, or chapter, they weren't called chapters necessarily, was going to have that. Like, but I thought it was great that you entered late. And then that made it pertinent for the action to ensue, because he was out of breath, Angela was out of breath, and obviously something had just occurred and people were on his heels. So some people. So that was just I think, a smart screenwriting type of choice,
Thanks.
which
Yeah.
is also just a segue where you're seeding your possible action, and then it felt organic. It didn't feel contrived. And then conceptually, to open this up a bit, to go through concept, structure, character development, and scene work. And by the way, if you hadn't received that new version of the Pro Member Workbook, just remind me and I'll send it to you.
I haven't, and I love that. Thank you.
Because you still have those privileges and you're in great standing. The device of the concussion that Nick suffered, I thought was a smart choice. I don't know that Holden Caulfield is really telling the story to his therapist. So, but anything that I think gets people thinking, did that really happen?
Yeah.
But it makes Nick vulnerable and perhaps more sensitive and aware, though he comes across very positively and caring. More profoundly, you talked about the inspiration of paradise, but the idea of confining souls, that's all I'll say. How did that really click? Yeah, that's.
Yeah. So let me answer that. But first, regarding the first line, thank you for that compliment. And going back to earlier in our conversation about different drafts and everything. And, so first of all, coming in late and leaving early is directly from my screenwriting education. And so currently for the audience, the opening line is "Were you followed?" Like that's the first line of the entire book. It was not always like that, actually. And it takes place in the 16th century. So it says, "Were you followed?" And it opens up in this dark part of Venice in 1589, and then kind of goes into this action scene. Originally in the first draft, the first line was, "Fuck, that hurts." And it was in the present day, with Nick waking up in the hospital from a concussion. But that changed, I think, with my agent when we were doing those drafts. And
right,
then
so in a sense, you have a prologue and then you get to the modern day.
Yeah, I don't call it a prologue though, because apparently this is what people say, that people don't read prologues. So I actually don't call it prologue, but it is a prologue. Yeah.
No, that's smart, I think. A lot of writers, sequence one in their 363, unfortunately, is only a scene or two, and it's really the prologue that'll be in the scene outline. But everybody starts from the beginning and is so linear in their process, overly linear in early drafts, that they put too much emphasis on it. Structurally, the dual time, the back and forth, the 35% of the story, it's crucial to understanding the relevance of this because there is backstory. There's 450 years of backstory. That's different from a true structural decision because that's just arranging the elements and the telling of the story. That's not as inherent as creating incremental stages of an adventure, meaning that structure is really the cultivation of that connection between the intimacy within relationship coinciding with signposts and events that make up a more full experience.
Mhm.
One question from the outset, though, is just the decision making to do the dual time in a way where you're going back, and then of course there are opportunities to go back and forth. So was there a rule for yourself, not a rule of thumb in the industry, but your own guideline where you said, when I'm back there, this is how people speak or the reader experiences or that sort of thing?
So I had to write all of the scenes in the past from the point of view of whatever character that was. And I would say that this was one of the most, everything about it was one of the most challenging things from a structural standpoint to the actual writing itself. And the scenes, the flashbacks are told anachronistically as well, which was a conscious decision because kind of like what you were talking about with Holden Caulfield, is this a real true story? And I wanted these pieces to seed Nick's brain, but then also for the reader to wonder, like, is all of this really happening or not? And you'll have to read it to find out. So to put that into the right structure with the linear chronological present day storyline was pretty tricky. And in answer to your question, my rule was to make sure that whatever scene was being told in the past directly affected the scenes that were happening in the present at that time. So then they were intertwined.
Was there a decision not to have more of a classic dynamic progression where Isabella had more pages?
Yes, actually. And this also came about in the drafts that I edited with my agents. I used to have way more perspective chapters. So chapters that were told from other characters' perspectives. Right now, I think there's maybe 5 or 6 perspectives in the book, and there probably used to be about 7 or 8, including from Isabella's perspective.
It's
my
funny
agent,
because I had a note after I printed my questions, any discussion of consolidating characters, even more than you did.
Yeah. Probably not more than I did. I think we landed on what is in the final, but yeah. So I used to have more chapters from her perspective, but that was a conscious decision. Not just conscious, but actually we talked about that and discussed it quite a bit.
And then so did you struggle with determining a low point or considering who is the real dynamic character, since Nick does interact with many characters and Julia isn't around as much during some of his key combative events and his interactions with Della Porta? And so, structurally, it doesn't feel episodic because I think Nick as a character is very passionately involved in the story and has a sense of mission. I think it's interesting structurally, and this is more of a structure of a sequence. And sometimes I joke in books that instead of sequences, they're sections and they're 20 to 30 pages each instead of 10-page sequences like in the 363. And for anybody new here, a 363 is an exercise I created 33 years ago, a 1-page story map with a premise line at top and 12 sequence statements that represent a premise line for each 10 pages of story. So sometimes I joke that in a book, a sequence is a section, but with a Q, S-E-Q. I'm kidding, but it's not that funny. But I thought within one of the sections, I liked what your writing approach, where he's having a moment of conflict with Julia, which is his wife, but he's not revealing that much about his experience with Paradise or his feelings. And then shortly after he does. And I thought that was cool. It's almost like the opposite of a ghost. It's like, I think there's a Swedish term for it. When you anticipate something, and then it happens. And a lot of times in scripts or books, when it's working well, the reader or the audience is saying, tell her.
Yep.
And then you withhold it, but it makes you invest. And then a few pages later, it's revealed.
Yes. I absolutely intentionally do that for the reader. But sometimes I also intentionally twist it. Like I kind of go in that direction and maybe give them a red herring and then twist it and they're like, oh, wow. Yeah. So for dynamic characters, I mean, Julia is the main dynamic character. And I needed her to balance Nick's misbehaviors. Which is another writer's bootcamp terminology. And by the way, I still use a 363 with every single project I work on.
Right. I was going to ask about how the adaptation of the screenplay, how the 363 evolved, or how you used it initially. But of course, you can play more jazz and you can weave more in prose, but the adaptation will be probably somewhat streamlined if it becomes a movie.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so adapting it from a script to a book was challenging, but I almost, in a sense, used the script as an outline. And right now, one of the projects I'm working on, I was hired by an author to adapt her book into a script. And that's been incredibly challenging because you're taking so much but boiling it down. You know, you need to be combining characters, you need to be combining plot lines. It's very, very difficult. Time itself. Yeah.
And that's why I'm not a fan of B stories necessarily, but supporting characters can have an impact on the main story. They intersect usually, or they're some microcosm. But the best way to fix a script is through a dynamic progression, even if you're fixing storylines, and those storylines are only 8 to 15 minutes or pages. At least each main character can have a dynamic character, and you can create a progression of conflict, even if it's two cops talking about what they're going to get their partner, their soul partners for their anniversaries or for their birthdays, and it's just repartee. But in a sequence or a section in a book, there's a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah.
Especially in something with so much historical context, and where there are many reveals and levels of not just intrigue, but levels of story where you need to know something else in order to figure out something beyond that.
Yeah, there could be emotional levels.
Right. So just a few things about character. In the first 20 to 40 pages, you give us Angelo, Della Porta, Enzo, Nick and Julia, Carlo. But I thought structurally, that's a solid thing about character. The misbehaviors of most characters are pretty clear.
Mm-hmm.
And the reveal later about the artist, all of those details are fascinating. The prose style, as I said, one of the compliments you got was that it's immersive, but it's eminently readable. So what's the balance there? And I just let me get through a few things, and you can answer anything or nothing. What decisions of point of view, style of prose, spare or on the range of more descriptive and atmospheric, vocabulary, even if it was a set finite list, or decisions of character separation to terms about how much detail of art, architecture, surroundings. You did a lot of that, but I also think they were judicious choices, because what's evolved at Writers Bootcamp over the last 10 years is a 15-point prose style sheet, so that a writer, it might not preempt an editor, although most editors aren't focusing on structure. The best ones can do both structure and the prose on the page and editing in that way. So on your prose style sheet, what are 3 or 4 or 5 decisions you made? I think there was one phrase, and I don't have the note here, where I said would. It was something about the light in the where Angelo was about to get away, and he was relieved that the light would be, and I was like, would be? Anyway, I wasn't trying to make like a critique of the prose, but there's a conscious decision in point of view tense and just the set of words that you're choosing, because they might not speak in contractions in 1589.
And then, but ironically, they actually use them more than we do now, which is something that I found out in my research, but most people think it's actually the former. Yeah, it's really kind of all the above. And going back to the differences between screenwriting and novel writing is that with novel writing, you have to, you know, every single piston needs to be firing. I mean, you have that in screenwriting as well, and it needs to be perfect, but you don't necessarily need to have every single sentence grammatically correct in the script, you know what I mean? So I have a very, very, very long list of things to be looking for, including like my echo words and all those things, making sure that there's a rhythm and a flow to the sentences, right? So you don't want to have every single sentence, you know, you talk a lot about the mundane left, and I use that as well in books. You want to make sure that every single sentence doesn't start with a pronoun or a name and has that same kind of sentence construction. You got to mix that up. And it ends up being pretty difficult, you know, to also make sure that it comes out. To be honest, I actually think I'm not really that great of a natural writer. I think I'm a much better storyteller than I am of a writer. So it takes me a long time to make the sentences really good and look at the structure of every single one, look at the word choice for every single one, make sure it's unique. I will admit I do use this program called Pro Writing Aid, which is an add-on on Word, and you can run through that and they'll tell you like your echo words and things like that. And
by echo you mean, is that those involuntary words or the repetition?
Yeah, it's a repetition and proximity of one word to another word.
And not in a good way.
And not in a good way, right? Okay. I mean, sometimes
because echo can sound very nice.
Yeah, you usually not in a good way. Like if you want to put emphasis on it, it could be in a good way. Oh, another thing, actually, to be honest, the thing I probably look for the most is to make sure it's active writing. So I try to make sure that about 85 or 90% of my prose is active. And the other 10 to 15%, if it's not active, it's actually intentionally not active to make sure you have that balance.
I looked at the digital version, was because it has the quotes at the beginning by other writers, the testimonials, it has a few blank pages. I looked at 334 pages. And so early on, I was, well, not early on, I was aware of it early on. And then later when I look back, I was like, where are we at 80 and 160 and 240 and 320? And, you know, these days, my presumption is, and I'm not an expert in publishing, though through moments like this, there's greater immersion and study. Excuse me. 350-page book, it's like somewhere between 250 and 350 seems like an industry standard unless it's a novella. But there also seem to be more words and there seem to be like around 39, 40 lines a page. And so that's more words than the 250 per page that we often take as a general rule of thumb in other kinds of prose writing.
Mm.
I'm just opening up in case there are comments that you have on that. I will say I was impressed as I kept reading that while there's exposition and riffs on history and Nick is finding out and almost getting lessons at times, which are for us, but the continuation of the levels of discovery that the interactions are revealing, even 200 pages in, and I think I was looking at page 197, and I just was thinking about the need for you to mete out that information and that process. Can you just offer us a couple sentences or thoughts on not simply the structuring of the story as far as where the page count is landing ultimately, because there are drafts where you're writing long or too linearly, or I'm sure the problem with word creep, which leads to idea creep, where you're following your own words and going off in tangents. And then like, I could just cut that 3 pages I wrote, because I didn't accomplish anything. But can you just discuss that balance between exposition and new information that the characters need to know, that the readers need to know, and just an approach?
Yeah, it was very important to me that the reader learned along with Nick. And actually, going back to that comparison with the Da Vinci Code, which I love, by the way, and I love Dan Brown's books. They're fun and they're interesting at the same time, and they teach you something. And Robert Langdon is a great character, but I suppose my one critique of his work is that Robert Langdon literally knows like everything. He'll know like how many. I talk about dimensions and stuff of some things, but in like paintings in my work, but like Robert Langdon will know like to the inch, like every single painting in Florence. And so I wanted to have the total opposite of that with Nick and make him this very much an everyman who has very, very little knowledge, if any, of art. He's not very familiar with Europe. He's just kind of like this regular guy. But he is smart and resourceful and also physically strong and active. So, but in terms of all the exposition, it was really important to me that the reader learned along with him. So as he needed,
so with more than a third of the book left, because that again on like around 204, I made a note. It doesn't, I don't want to give away too much, but you didn't disappoint. And I wondered that the let's call it the artist's alchemy and the interaction between the plying of craft and nearly magic or transformation, the decision where that should land, I think, is fascinating. And then a few pages back, how do you pronounce the name? Paganelli?
Yeah, Paganelli, yeah.
Paganelli. He tells the story about the monks making a decision to bring in Tintoretto. How much is that a riff of your imagination? And how much of that is based on something?
Well, thanks for asking that, and I love that question. Anything that has to do with the ancient order, the secret society, and the magical part of it is from my own imagination. Now, I happen to be a Mason. I'm a master Mason. So I was informed by my knowledge of Masonic rituals to be able to create a brand new secret society. But I did, as I was saying, like a lot of the things that happened in the past. So like I kind of welded my imagination and fused it with things that did happen in the past to make it seem like it could have been real. So like the monks were a real order, for example. And I traced it back to Marco Polo. Like a lot of that stuff is real, and I brought in real characters into my imagination.
So it's not quite a conspiracy story, because it's the history of a potential conspiracy. But then when you mention that you're a master Mason, I think it ignites more investigation of the overall conspiratorial like possibilities here, right?
Maybe, but I'm not
Which isn't
practicing
bad
it.
for selling books, right?
It's funny that you say that actually, because I don't have control over, Amazon has these subcategories and I don't have control over them. They change. I don't know how they change or who's doing it, but often one of the categories, the subcategories, is conspiracy thriller. And I'm like, this is not a conspiracy thriller. When I hear conspiracy thriller, I think spy novel or whatever. So,
Right.
yeah.
One more thing about, I meant those few questions, and I'll open up to a little Q&A in about 5-6 minutes. I really meant some of those questions not to be so much about structure, but I can't help but say, oh, that's 2/3 in, and is that near a low point? And we're still learning new things. And in a book like this, I think it's okay to learn something additional in the third act. I don't love when newer writers wait until the third act to introduce the topic. I look at the second act as the adventure. Then we're holding the audience there with gravity and saying this is what it means, and then the amends or the tasks that the character has to go through can still reveal detail.
Yeah, there could be reveals, but as long as, in my opinion, as long as it's not a coincidence, especially not a cliche or surprise information. There's one thing that I cannot stand, whether it's books or movies or TV or anything, where it's like the reveal is the kill, this is the killer, and it's like someone you never expected in your wildest dreams, like that kind of thing. You have to have those hints and plant those
Deus Ex
seeds.
Machina.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and let me compliment you. There's a certain gravity in these passages that you write with. A better word is perhaps it's plausible. It feels authentic in the moment, authenticity. But then and by gravity, I don't even mean that it's so serious all the time, but it's very grounded, and that's impressive.
Thanks. And that was really important to me too, because I wanted, and this kind of goes back to what you were asked before about what's real and what's not. And it was really important to me to make sure that the magical side of things is plausible. So I grounded everything in as real a world that I could.
Yeah, that was well done as a writer.
Thanks.
And how is the book deal impacting the potential readaptation of the screenplay?
Well, all that stuff as a writer goes on behind the scenes. So agents are watching, get on it.
Right, exactly. And in the industry, like when you found the original producers from the execs from the old DreamWorks that moved to create their own company, did you have any reps at the time, or was that just through connecting with people?
I did have a manager and also an agent at one point as a screenwriter. I don't recall though at that time, but I met them. So Kevin Wilmering and Frank Gladstone. I met Kevin.
I love Frank. We did a 2-day event at DreamWorks for 80 story artists like 15 years ago. Frank's fantastic.
Yeah, they both are. And I met Kevin at some event. I don't think I had representation at the time though.
Got it. And then just on a personal level, in a way, since you're a parent now, how's Tiffany doing as a mom? I'm sure she's spectacular.
Yes, well, thank you for asking.
And as a life partner, talk about knowing soulmates. I saw you guys early on in your relationship, and I was always, blown away by that connection between you guys.
Yeah, so she's doing great. And she's an incredible mom and an incredible wife. And, it's funny, one of the ideas of my book is, or the questions, the moral questions is, are soulmates destined to be together or not? And I think that's a pretty interesting question. And I am lucky enough that I did find my soulmate. So she's doing great. So
and I'm sure she would have something to say about that, knowing Tiffany. But really what I'm asking is, isn't the writing a form of adventure and an alternative to traveling, since your other priorities may preempt some of the adventures you had back in the day?
I'm going to say no. No, I still love traveling. In fact, we took our first international trip just back in May. My brother lives in London, and one of my oldest friends lives in Amsterdam. And so we went to Amsterdam, England, and Scotland, and it was just amazing. And nothing beats that.
Amazing. And then how fluent is your Italian?
Not fluent at all. I
Because
never
you're
actually.
because Nick suddenly speaks Italian.
And also Venetian, by the way, which is a different dialect, which is something I learned while working on this project, and kind of late. In fact, going back to the whole draft thing, I actually had to go back in and put the whole Venetian thing in addition to Italian to make it more authentic. Because
Wow.
again, it was so important to me that everything was as authentic as
And how
possible.
long does that special, you know, we have a recommended process for stages of work, but then in between, at intervals, there are other exercises, creative research, and something that I call bullet essays, which is a form of journaling where you have to figure something out or make a decision, and it's like you having a legal pad or a memo pad next to you when you're typing in your main document, and then you have to go off and do that. How long does it take to figure out the Venetian dialect historically? Does that take 2 days? Does it take 7 weeks?
Okay, so I did live in Italy for a little bit. I never studied it formally, but I have studied pretty much all the languages around Italy. So I was able to at least get the basis of it. There's also Google Translate. However, again, I wanted it to be as authentic as possible. So I actually hired an Italian woman from Venice to do the interpretation into both Italian and Venetian. The research part of things could take, sometimes it's quick, sometimes it could take me hours for one sentence.
Because it's elusive. You don't know where you're going to find the answer.
You could either go down a rabbit hole of research, which can be fun, or it's because I know that there's like something particular that I need, but I can't find it. Like a good example is like how, men used to shave and stuff like that. And I needed to know like a specific type of razor. I think this is actually in the second book though, but it took me forever to find that. Or like the scene when Paganelli, kind of early on, Paganelli goes into this older museum and he goes into this room, and I needed to know like these exact like these sconces on the wall, and I need to know like the exact ones, and that was incredibly difficult. But fortunately, I was in this writing group in LA actually, and one of the women in the writing group was like a research librarian at UCLA, and there was like literally like one book probably in America that had the information, and she was able to get it for me. But that,
by the way, early on, is it Della Porta who, under the seat or the bench, pulls the lever?
Yeah,
that was an incredible moment early on, where you're like, oh, I've got to keep reading, not just for work, but because it was cool. So I'll open to a few questions, but Rob, again, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Jeff. It's been so awesome speaking with you. It's been too long. I wish we were in person.
I know. And let me know when you guys come out here. But also, because, and we've got pro members on this at this event today, but pro members can now be in the LA groups because of Zoom. So the fortunate side effect of the pandemic is that a lot of alumni can be in my project groups, and we have one on Wednesdays and one on Thursday mornings. So that's been a great part of the process. But I want to also thank you that the basic training is 10 weeks now. The next one is January 10th. It's $2,500, but if you want to support a colleague, a friend, a loved one, that's our version of an honorarium as a thank you for your participation today.
Wow, well, thank you so much. And I will definitely take you up on that, and I'll think about, so I'm in a pretty amazing writing group here in Denver. So maybe I'll just like throw it out there and see first come, first
You
serve
could
or
do a
something.
competition. Whoever reads your manuscripts faster gets it. Okay, so
Thank you.
I have a few questions in advance. Thank you. Ben Koldyke, LA Pro member. The transition from research to writing, what is the process? I tend to get bogged down in amassing info and am slow to pages.
So wait, sorry, you broke up there for a second. Can you repeat that, please?
In the transition from research to writing, what's the toggle? What's your process? He's saying he tends to get bogged down in amassing the info, and therefore he's slower to the pages. And maybe that's an earlier stage versus you need one thing, and so where it
No,
fits.
yeah, I think I would imagine everybody is different, but unfortunately, I'm kind of like him. Whereas I'm a big outliner, and I'm a huge proponent of that. But when I'm outlining, it only goes so far as I'll know that something might need to be in the past or reference the past or whatever it is, but I don't do the research at that point. So I do the research while I'm writing, and I'll literally, and this is probably not the right way to do it, but I will then go down this rabbit hole of the research, and it could be one word, literally, that takes me a while to do. But the plus side of that, I think, is that oftentimes I'll find something during that research that can be used elsewhere.
Got it. And then Christy Wall, LA Pro member living on the East Coast. Were there any of the differences between the script, like promoting the script and selling the book, that caught you off guard, where you really weren't prepared for something, probably on the book side?
Yes, time. So I think a lot of people like to complain about a lot of the issues in Hollywood. There are also a lot of issues in publishing. And one of them, for me anyway, is how glacially slow it is. If you think it takes a while to do anything in Hollywood, literally you could add months. So just the time that it takes to query an agent, and then for the agent to get back to you, and then if you are lucky enough to sign with an agent, and then for the agent to go out on submission with the publishers and for them to get back to you, all that could take ages. And by the time you actually sign with the publisher, it could be a year before that book is published. It's insane. Like you could make a movie in the amount of time.
Was this at its core a pandemic project?
Yeah, actually. So the release was delayed by a year because of the pandemic. Now, there were some silver linings to that, because it did enable me to go back and make a whole bunch of edits and improve the book. And actually, so I also started working on the second book. So I was able to make changes that facilitated the second and third book stories, which is
Did
cool.
you start it at the outset of the pandemic? Because no, it had to be before,
No.
because
Yeah.
the first
I
book
started it way
was,
before. Yeah. I signed with my publisher in something like December 2019.
got it.
Yeah.
And then she also says, do you have a preference now between screenwriting and book writing?
That's a fantastic question. And, I really, really do like both. I think that the speed thing that I was talking about sort of leads me a little bit more towards screenwriting. And I apologize to any of my author friends or anybody who's watching from the publisher or anything. I still do love books and all that. They have incredible nuances into character and things like that you just cannot possibly capture on film. But it's the gratification, I suppose, with screenwriting. And by the way, with a yes or a no, whether you get a pass or a recommendation or whatever, you get that answer just so much faster.
I mean, and if maybe there's a quotient of 3, because 350 pages versus 115 pages, and when I look at a 10 draft process for a script in 6 months, working 10 hours a week, I don't estimate that same amount of time to complete a book through 10 drafts.
No
Although
way. I
5
think
of
it's
those
safe to,
drafts are
yeah.
craft issues or craft.
Yeah, I would say that books probably have 4 times as many words.
Right.
or more. Yeah.
Great, great. Was it this is Tony Petrosian, filmmaker, longtime LA Pro member. Was it advantageous to write your story as a screenplay first and then adapt it? I think maybe we covered that.
Yes,
Would you have
because I
done it
used this. Yeah, I used the script as an outline, and that was
Yeah.
incredibly useful. And then I
So
think
you-
that could help make going back to improving the script.
Right. So you wouldn't have done it the other way around.
Right.
And I believe that too, because not that we're saying there aren't distinctions between movies and TV and between movies, TV, and books. And if you have an ensemble story, which is different than just calling a cast an ensemble, then a book or a book series can adapt well to TV,
Yeah.
like Game of Thrones. But the distinctions are crucial for each of these forms. That being said, the 363 is so helpful. Obviously, you don't need it in a TV episode because we don't have sequences in TV. We have events happen within scenes and storylines are shorter. So then I think that answers the rest of it. And Michael Zanettis, LA Pro member. I think we covered this. Did you use the form of the novel to explore aspects of the story that would not be possible in film?
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's no question about
Any
that.
specific examples of like another rabbit hole or tributary that we didn't cover?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that question, that's part of the process of book writing that I really like, actually. Like if I'm deep into a character's head and I need to explore his or her thoughts, particularly as they relate to a scene, I get in the zone and I'll just like type, and that's, I think, part of it that I really do love that you just cannot possibly have in film. Yeah, and then talking about the adaptations, I mean, there's obviously, there are books that are adapted into movies and TV all the time, but we see that some are better than others, and it's kind of interesting. Is it because there's maybe one way or the other is the way to tell that particular story? And with the book that I'm working on now that I'm adapting into a script, I actually asked the author to create a 363 when we were working on the outline.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Ann Thornley Brown asks, I just lost her first question. This is really about maybe what you've learned about the business. She says the first part I think we've covered. Is it possible to sell a screenplay without first having a book deal? Of course. There seems to be a preference for transforming novels to screenplays, then vice versa. So anything you've gained that even maybe 10, 12 years ago as a strategy, do you think this is something moving forward that you'll continue to do? Like as you're doing your books, you'll do a quick screenplay draft or at least a 363 and a horizontal, and then use that. For me, that first 3-4 weeks, that first stage of achievement, it's the same.
Yeah.
It's just that the sequences are 20 to 30 pages versus 10, mostly as a result of the compactness of the writing. And it's a cliche to say that we're in a visual writing form. It's that we're using the parts of the story to tell the story. So there's a little less explanation in that way.
It's a really interesting question. And I did not write the second book as a script before writing it. And partly, I suppose, because of time. Like, I honestly wish I could. But I am a very, very heavy outliner, as I mentioned, and I don't think it would actually take me that long to take that outline that I had and convert it into a script, as opposed to a book that wasn't written in that sense or that style. Because like I said, I do use the 363 prior to creating that more in-depth outline, as well as a horizontal and the 30-30. And I do have kind of a non-linear approach to writing it as well.
If we could highlight it, the book, how many italicized lines, which are the character's thought, are there, do you think? It's not one a page.
I have
I think there are 150 of them.
Probably.
I like that. You can do a version of that in a script. It's just not we'd have to hear it.
Yeah, there's voiceover or whatever. Yeah, there's different kind of gimmicky things to do it. Yeah.
Amara Falk, a current pro member who's participating from Minnesota, said, when you were doing the rewrites with the agents, did you ever have a disagreement? And I think she's looking for, you know, a story here. No, I'm kidding. You can name names. No, again, I'm kidding. But just about the direction and how you handled that.
Yeah, there were a few actually. And there is this balance where you don't want to piss them off, but you also want to stick to your own creative vision. But then you also want to look to their guidance. They have their finger on the pulse. They're submitting things all the time, and they know when things get rejected and stuff like that. So there were a few times, almost always, I always listen to every single critique or every single note and consider it. And typically I would apply their notes to the draft, but there were a couple of times when I was pretty adamant. And what I did was list out a reason, a list. I gave them a list of reasons as to why I thought that my approach or idea was the way to go. And they would reply and say, thanks for setting up and, in that fashion. And we do agree with you. Now, there are still to this day, some notes that they had that I kind of questioned if it was the right idea or not. And I can give you specific examples, but there's no turning back now.
Exactly.
Right.
All right. So what's up? What's ahead? The next, are you going to be writing over the holidays? What's your goal for 2023? And is there anything else that we can do to support you, help you? Should we all be emailing our friends the Amazon link?
Yes. First of all, definitely tell every single person you've ever met in your life about my book. And it doesn't even have to just be Amazon. It's available, Barnes and Noble. Some stores in LA, if they don't have it, they can actually just ask and they can order it. And the audiobook for The Prisoner of Paradise is out. And the audiobook for Painter of the Damned is actually coming out in just 11 days. And I'm super excited for that. And by the way, non-biased, I'm obviously the writer, but I do want to promote the audiobook because the narrator is so phenomenal. I listen to audiobooks all the time, and some are great, some are not that great, probably because of the narrator. This narrator is amazing, and talk about like skill sets. It's like doing a one-man play or one-woman play. To memorize the voices of all these different characters, the accents, for two different timelines. It's amazing. And he did a fantastic job. And then, yes, I will absolutely be writing over the holidays, Thanksgiving, and all the holidays in December. So my goal for 2022 is to get the first draft of the script that I'm talking about done. And the goal for the first part of 2023 is to get the third book finished, which I am working on right now. And then once that's off to the publishers, I will then go back and write a second novella, the spin-off series.
And then 10 hours a week or more?
I would say that's a little bit more. Yeah, we're talking about probably more like 20 hours a week.
Right. Seems like it.
Yeah.
And then I think there was one other thing. As far as the audiobooks, do you feel by listening it's enough to teach you about prose style, or do you really need to look?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as an author, when I listen, I do try to listen for prose style. And there have been times when I've gone, Amazon has this thing where you can do it simultaneously, and I have done that. And there have also even been other times when I didn't have that set up, and I was listening to the way a book was crafted, like especially authors who I love, like David Mitchell, for example, or Elmer Towles. So David Mitchell wrote like Cloud Atlas, and Elmer Towles wrote A Gentleman in Moscow and the Lincoln Highway, and I love their writing styles. So because the narrator is putting their own voice and inflection and everything into it, but I thought that it sounded like it could have been really, really well written, I did go back and look to see how it was written. Yeah.
And can you do that in a set of 5 or 10 pages, or does it take more?
I think he can probably do that in a set of 5 or 10 pages. Yeah.
Because isn't the way somebody misbehaves on one page similar to the way they misbehave on every page?
I think it's, yeah, or even if you're just looking at like prose style, I think that's a fair assessment.
That's what I
To a
recommend
point.
for the aspiring prose writers here. Rob, again, thank you. Regards to Tiffany. Happy holidays. We'll be in touch soon. And anybody here who has questions for Rob, I can compile them. And he is a writer after all. So JG at Writers Bootcamp, let me know. And if there's any follow-up apart from something for Rob, feel free to email me. And thanks everybody for being here. And again, for your time, Rob.
And thank you, Jeff. Yeah, and if anyone wants to follow me, I'm like basically on all social media platforms. Again, something you don't necessarily need to do as a screenwriter, but my website's robsamborn.com. And I thank everyone in the audience for joining us. And Jeff, thank you. And thank you to everybody at Writers Bootcamp. This has been amazing. And if there are any novelists out there who are thinking about screenwriting, check out Writers Bootcamp. You will not be disappointed.
Cool. Thanks so much.
Thank
Have
you,
a good
Jeff.
afternoon and
Happy
happy
holidays.
holidays, everybody.